This is the first of two slideshows related to our case study this week on colonial and post-colonial embodiments. This first slideshow will focus on images related to the two readings on Indigenous and European interaction in North America, including the Illinois Confederation along the Mississippi River with the French, and then the post-colonial effects on Osage material cultural practices in Oklahoma. The first piece about Jean-Baptiste Sagouin-Goara, the Metis man discussed in Sophia White's chapter, brings us directly into the colonial encounter between Indigenous and European peoples during the colonial period. Now, this Metis man, Jean-Baptiste, negotiated a space between two radically different worldviews, particularly as regards the body. Consider this image of Colonel Guy Johnson and Karanghayontie, or Captain David Hill, from 1776. Colonel Johnson is shown wearing a uniform of a British officer, but we notice he also has a woven sash around his waist, moccasins on his feet, an Indian blanket thrown over his shoulder, and a hat which appears to be adorned with indigenous beading. Behind him stands, like a shadow presence, an image of a Native American man, and very much in very traditional indigenous dress. In very much the same way, European engagements on the frontier of colonial North America were fraught with this tension between maintaining the boundaries between societies, British or French civilization, and I say that in quotes, on the one hand, and indigenous societies on the other, a tension that was emerged from the inevitable adaptations to a new world, a new natural environment, and new cultural influences. This painting was created by Benjamin West, who was known for his paintings of Native Americans in the 18th century. And he's known specifically for the way in which he often portrays Native Americans as a kind of noble savage, which we see here in this painting and in the next image. West's painting reminds us to read all of the images that we're going to look at in this slideshow in the context of a particular historical moment, and also with the understanding that we're looking at largely European representations of indigenous dress and embodied behavior. When English or French encountered and interacted with Lenape, Illinois, Iroquois, Huron, they encountered a culture rooted in a fundamentally different worldview. And this difference of worldview was also enacted across and in and through the body. Take a look, for instance, at this image of Penn's Treaty with the Indians, also created by Benjamin West, which commemorates the treaty that William Penn signed with the Lenape in what is now present-day Pennsylvania in 1682. Now, West's image is admittedly a romanticized image of settler colonialism, but it also provides us with a glimpse into the differences between these two cultures as regards the body. On the left, we have Penn and his fellow Quakers, who are admittedly a very specific kind of European, clad in woolen jackets, knee breeches, white linen collar or cuffs, felt hats on their heads. All are standing, with the exception of the tradesman who is interacting with the Native Americans. On the contrast, we see on the right side, the Lenape. The men are in various positions. They are, some of them sitting on the ground. There are women present, which is something that is not true on the other side. And they are clothed very differently, obviously. They're not wearing suits. They're wearing cloths around their waist. They have things draped over their shoulders. In some cases, they have their hair is elaborately styled, or they're wearing a headdress that includes brightly colored feathers and also decorative beadwork. Now, this is a contrast that we'll see again and again in images of the colonial encounter, particularly in contexts of trade and diplomacy. And here we see it again in this detail from a map of the inhabited part of Canada from a French survey in 1777. A European man trading fur with an Indigenous Canadian. And of course, we see again an image of a Native American sitting on the ground. He's smoking a long pipe. The other man is standing there wearing a breechcloth around his waist, a blanket draped or hide, we can't tell, draped over his shoulder. He's wearing beaded necklaces. His hair is adorned with a feathered headdress. And we also see that he has leggings and moccasins and markings on his body, which is something that's something that a lot of the indigenous tribes of the eastern woodland did during this period. We, of course, have a European man smoking a pipe, but he's standing up, leaning on the barrel, and then the other European man is fully clothed in a suit and jacket, hat, looking very much like a nice member of the gentry or a merchant. Another image I love for the contrast that it shows in this frontier colonial context is the Indians giving a talk to Colonel Bouquet, which portrays a diplomatic interaction on the western Pennsylvania frontier. And again, we can see very different embodiments on either side of the fire. The European men who are also standing with their bodies relatively closed, worried perhaps. The one man who is sitting at a desk taking down notes. On the other side, we have a very animated, probably Shawnee man holding a belt of wampum and gesticulating. We have men sitting on the ground around him, one smoking, and then the other men standing behind him are listening very intently. And again, these men are clothed in the kind of traditional garb that we've come to associate. Finally, one last image is this of Sir John Caldwell in 1780 by an unknown artist wearing a full Iroquois dress. And as opposed to the hybrid costume that we saw in our first British officer, here we have someone who was fully clad in Indigenous dress. He was a British officer who served on the frontier during the French and Indian War. He's wearing gifts who had been given to his uncle, who was a commander of Fort Niagara from 1774 to 76. It was a gift from the Six Nations. So now we could see this as a costume that's kind of very fantastical and imaginative, like he's playing Indian. But one of the things that we see when we look closely at this is it's actually a very accurate depiction of the dress of northern woodland Indian tribes like the Iroquois. So we see the silver breastplate, often given to chiefs by European diplomats, big silver ear pendants, a headscarf covered with silver rings. He's wearing a breechcloth, and then high leggings, moccasins, and he's also wearing this loose linen shirt that's hanging loose, untucked, obviously, and is probably belted with a sash underneath some of the other adornments that he's wearing. So these initial images are just to kind of suggest to us the way in which there's already some kind of imagination and exchange, and also just kind of what historians have called a kind of initially a middle ground where people are coming together and attempting to negotiate vastly different worldviews. Of course, by the time this painting is made, after the French and Indian War, we're looking at settler colonialism as being fully enacted, and so therefore, this is we get a different feeling from this painting. Now, moving on, I want to talk about the specific area of New France that is in your reading, and this is New France down from Illinois down to New Orleans along the Mississippi River. And the Indian groups that would have been encountered by the French along this river belonged to a confederation of tribal groups under the heading of the Illinois or Illini Confederation. They dominated this area of North America at this time. They called themselves Heleni or Illiniwek, meaning men, which the French then rendered as Illinois. They were composed as many 12 distinct bands. The Illini Confederation was a grouping of these related tribes bound to each other through kinship and a common language, which is actually very close to Algonquin languages. And like most of the other tribal nations encountered by the English or French during this time, they were an early woodland culture. And their confederation spanned from Lake Michigan to Iowa, Illinois, and south to Missouri and Arkansas. And they traded down along the river all the way to New Orleans. Most of them spoke dialects of the Miami, Illinois language, which is one of the Algonquin languages spoken. Another would be Lenape, which was the tribal group I was showing you earlier. Now, again, we have a series of images. These were generated by European artists. portraying, but we can look across them to identify certain patterns of dress and embodiment in these southeastern woodland tribal groups. This is a couple of Yucci Indians, and this is the Indian queen and king of Yucci. And we see here, again, very similar to some of the prior images that we saw, the breechcloth, leggings, moccasins, a bare chest, but then covered with an animal hide, the woman wearing a skirt and then a blanket over her shoulders. This man also is wearing some sort of adornment over his chest. He's got markings on his face. And actually, markings on the face and body were something that were very typical and common among these tribal groups at this time. Here is the Foxman from 1720, also wearing a breechcloth and moccasins. And then here's an actual member of the Illinois Nation, the Kaskaskia tribe. And we can see here the kind of embodiment of how somebody might have dressed during this period. The long shirt, belted at the waist with a sash, the deerskin leggings, also often belted below the knee, the moccasins, a headdress, right? And then he has these markings on his face, and his hair is, in this case, he's wearing it in a kind of mohawk fashion. And we see there's like a range of ways in which Indigenous men would have worn their hair during this period. This is one of them. As I mentioned, these Illinois tribal nations encountered the French as they colonized New France, and specifically along what was known as Illinois country or Indian country along the Mississippi. And this is one final image from another European artist, Debatz. And this is showing Indians of different nations. So this is a kind of very loose portrayal of several different tribal nations, representatives of several different tribal nations gathered outside New Orleans for the purpose of trading. So you see here they have their trade goods, their hides, and we can see the commonalities across their way of dressing, as well as some of the differences. Some have markings on their body, some do not. Some are wearing their hair in braids, others have their hair cropped on the side. And then there is this curiosity of this darker skinned figure in the center right. I don't have a clear read on who this was meant to represent. In Sophie White's book, she does talk about the presence of people of African descent in Illinois country, and how that played a role in the way in which everyone began to understand the racialization of Indigenous people. So this may very well be a person of African descent, or they may be a figure that is more a product of the artist's imagination. Now these Indians portrayed here in this picture were here in New Orleans to trade. And in fact, trade was one of the major ways in which European goods entered into Indigenous life. We know that before Indigenous people encountered Europeans, they encountered European trade goods, which came up through trade networks from Mesoamerica up through a southern trade route to North America, sometimes as far as Massachusetts. And many Indigenous groups were in fact eager to trade with Europeans. In many ways, they were like their European counterparts with tea, very enamored of certain novel goods, especially things like metal kettles, which they traded for pelts. In fact, kettles were so popular among Native American groups that they supplanted ceramic pots in Native American foodways, and this led to the actual disappearance of that art in those communities. On the other hand, the introduction of glass beads, which had been drilled with very fine metal drills, led to a flowering of the art of beadwork in many Native American cultures, and we see this period of contact as a real fluorescence, a period of great innovation and artistry in Native American beadwork because of the new kinds of materials that they were able to obtain through trade. The overall impact of the Columbian Exchange on Native American material life was largely quite damaging and created a dependency upon manufactured European goods. So there's the positive effect in the case of beads, but there's a largely negative effect in other areas. And speaking of beads, I want to say a little something about wampum. It's very tangential to your reading for the week, but it really is another item of material culture that embodies the differences in worldview between these two societies. Wampum has been described alternatively as Indian money or writing, when in fact it is really neither. It's a visual and physical embodiment of ritually created understandings through oral tradition. So a wampum belt can be read through oration. It's a mnemonic device used to recall important events, engagements, marriages, funerals, or to mark the creation of treaties. The beads traditionally were made of clam and whelk shells, and the belt had various patterns in which the beads were applied, which was the way in which it could function as a mnemonic device. Because the wampum was fashioned into a belt and used to keep oral history through the enactment of its oration, and embodied the understandings that were created through oration and negotiation, it could be revisited over time. It's not a static representation of those understandings in the way that writing might be. And this is some other examples of wampum. The one below on the bottom is actually the wampum belt that was supposedly exchanged between William Penn and the Lenape Indians to signal their friendship. Now, there's some talk in historiography about early on in the colonial era, especially on the frontier, that there was a kind of middle ground in which Native Americans and Europeans encountered one another, exchanged goods and information and cultural ideas, and that there's a great deal of hybridity and dialogue on these frontier edges of colonial life. We can see that in some ways in the case of wampum. We also see it in the ways in which Native Americans and Europeans exchanged items of clothing and ways in which they adapted through clothing to each other's cultural and environmental contexts. So here are a couple of images of Native Americans who have adopted Western dress. This is Tidayuskung, who was a Lenape chief, and we see that he is wearing this very formal colonial waistcoat and jacket and knee breeches and boots, so very European, but then he also has his hair dressed in the Indian fashion, and he's wearing ear pendants and again this silver breastplate. So we can see him sort of selectively adopting some aspects of dress. Here's Kumurania, who was written here as a dandy by the artist, but I think we can disregard that. But we see here a Peoria man, Peoria was one of the Illinois tribes, who was wearing a blue wool jacket in the style of a European officer or merchant. And this style of blue jacket becomes a staple of some indigenous clothing styles. So he's wearing this blue wool overcoat, but then he's also wearing a feathered hat. He's got traditional markings on his face. We see he's got very elaborate beadwork around his neck and along his chest. And the rattle that he holds in his hand is, of course, strictly indigenous. Now, one group that is particularly of interest in terms of this hybridity and colonial exchange are the Metis individuals, like Jean-Baptiste, who you read about for this week. Now, here's an example of a Metis coat from the 19th century that's in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And you can see that it's in a very similar style to a European coat with cuffs and collar, but then we have elaborate applique and beadwork in Native American patterns around, adorning the coat, as well as fringe at the shoulders and along the front and at the hem. And in fact, Metis dress was something that was of particular interest to people during the time, to the extent that Metis tended to combine in this fashion aspects of both the traditions from which they came. And you, of course, read about this in the chapter from Sophie White. Here we have a Metis man biracial, Indigenous and European, who's wearing this, again, this blue European overcoat with a Native American sash and beaded front piece, as well as deerskin leggings and moccasins. We also see hybridity of dress in individuals who, by virtue of their roles in their communities, were interfacing and interacting a lot with people from the other cultures. So we see this a lot with people who were in diplomatic roles and in trade roles. This is Nicholas Vincent, Tsawinhohui, which means one who plunges things into the water. He was actually Huron, and he was a grand chief of the Huron, and was from 1811 to 1844, and was extensively involved in negotiations on behalf of the Huron with the French, and English. And we see here him on the left wearing, again, this blue jacket with very similar silver medals, ear pendants. He's holding a belt of wampum. He's got leggings in the Indigenous fashion, as well as the sash and headdress, but he kind of at the base, he has this blue coat. And then we see him again on the right, the far right, again, very similarly clad to the other image. This is kind of a motif in Nicholas Vincent's representations of him, where he's always often wearing this blue coat with the Native American accessories. The oddity of the image in the middle, supposedly also of Nicholas Vincent, has him dressed, in fact, not in any identifiably Native American style, but in the style of the French voyageurs, the fur traders who journeyed along the Mississippi River and traded with Native American groups. So I want to say a little bit about the other side of this equation. We've talked a lot about Indigenous people adopting European aspects of dress and embodiment in order to interact with that side of the colonial encounter. And I want to say a little bit about the other side. Now, voyageurs were definitely identified both by their lifestyle, which was to live to travel along the rivers, and then also to portage through the forests. Here we have a couple of different voyager characters. Here's one guy in the back. Then in the front, we have someone in a classic voyager costume with the red cap, a red neckerchief, and you can't see it, but he's probably wearing a loose shirt, very much in the Native American style, and it's possibly sashed at his waist. Here we have another guy who's looking, it's kind of hard to tell whether he's Native American or European, but again, wearing this loose tunic, and then has some adornment around his neck and head that reminds us of Indigenous style. The voyageurs were identifiable by the way in which they combine both European and Indigenous dress. And these men portrayed here are very typical of the voyager costume. We have the leggings, the tied leggings in the Native American fashion, the sash around the waist in the Indigenous fashion, and this sort of cloak or shirt, tunic worn loose over, not a breechcloth in most cases, but often knee breeches, although there are some examples of voyageurs also wearing breechcloths as well. Voyageurs are often portrayed as having a gun in their hand or an oar, and invariably smoking a pipe. Here's some other images related to the voyager. We can see here on the right an actual I don't know whether it's a reproduction or historical, but it's a representation of the voyager costume in a museum. And then on the left, we have some related styles, Canadian frontier militia, who also would have dressed very similarly to the voyageurs. And now related to the voyageurs, there were also the coureurs de bois, or wood forest runners. They are really pretty much very much like voyageurs, except that they were a little bit more woodsmen. Often they might work as interpreters, and they also sometimes were involved in smuggling. Here we can see that our guy is wearing snowshoes in addition to his leggings and moccasins and this long coat, which was known as a capot. But the snowshoes particularly are an Indigenous thing that French woodsmen and voyageurs adopted to travel in this new environment. And this is an image actually from Sophie White's book, Genre Studies of Inhabitants and Indians of New France. And we can see on the top 2 examples of Native Americans who have adopted some form of a Western European dress into their embodiment while still doing so within what we would identify as an indigenous sartorial vocabulary. Then below we have these 2 who are very much kind of voyageurs in the hooded cloak, which was called a capot, the red hat, but then also tied at the waist. The guy on the left is wearing leggings, and the guy on the right is walking in snowshoes. So again, we can see the hybridity expressed through dress, but also other aspects of bodily adornment, as well as how these bodies were expected to move and operate within this environment. Then just to end, some images related to the reading on Osage wedding jackets. These are a traditional form of Osage folk art, which dates back to the contact with American military forces. Blue serge or wool overcoats were given by U.S. military personnel to the Osage Indians, among others, as gifts. And these coats were then incorporated into ritual and craft life of the Osage. So we see here some women who are in a procession, a ritual procession, wearing their costume, their Osage wedding jackets. These are used for weddings and then other ritual occasions, and usually they're also accompanied by a feathered hat or headdress. Here's some historical images. Here's a woman in a wedding coat. There's another woman from the 1950s in a wedding coat, again with the feathered hat. And we can see here in these cases of actual coats, we can see how the military underpinnings of this blue wool coat, but then the adornment, the way in which it's decorated, is very much within an Osage visual vocabulary. And in particular, many wedding coats are adorned with traditional Osage ribbon work, which is a form of decorative art that sees a fluorescence, again, after contact with Europeans, and incorporating the material of silk ribbons into Osage adornment and folk craft. So here are 2 more examples of coats and feathered hats. And I want to just give you a little bit of a look at the ribbon work itself. This ribbon work is extremely versatile and shows up in a lot of different ways in Osage costume. It's used to adorn the edges of blankets. Here we have it on the front and hem of a skirt. And then in the bottom left hand, this is a detail from a man's straight dance costume, again showing very similar. And just this image on the right is a close-up of the actual ribbon work itself. Here's some ribbon work featured on a wearing blanket. And again, a close-up, you can see how the 4 strips of ribbon are used to create the design. And although this ribbon work is very important to the women's wedding jackets, it also shows up in other places in Osage culture, especially in the costumes for men who dance the straight dance at the Inlanchka, which is a ritual dance occasion. And we can see here in this slide, there's many, many different iterations of this Osage ribbon work.